A black CEO boards a first-class flight after sealing a major deal. Ready to head home and enjoy the quiet satisfaction of success. But as he takes his seat, everything shifts. A flight attendant questions his place, demands his ticket, and skips him during service, all under the guise of procedure. 7 minutes later, the head flight attendant steps in. But what happens next sends shockwaves through the cabin and sparks a chain of events that no one expected. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The airport was alive with the pulse of travelers, families herding children, business people tapping hurriedly at their phones, and solitary wanderers lost in their own world of departures and arrivals. It was a place of constant motion. And yet, for Adrian Thomas, everything seemed to move slower, as if the air around him carried a different weight. He stood apart from the crowd in the first-class lounge, near the tall windows that overlooked the runway. His eyes drifted across the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip beneath the edge of the sky, painting streaks of orange and deepening blue. There was something peaceful about the quiet hum of engines in the distance. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy blue suit, the fabric catching the light. He carried no ostentation, his wealth was not in the glint of watches or the flash of jewelry. It was in the way he stood, grounded but present. It was in the quiet confidence that only came with years of steady, unrelenting hard work. In his early 40s, Adrian was a man whose success was stitched into the seams of his life. He was the CEO of an aviation technology company, a leader who had reshaped the efficiency of air travel across the globe. But here, standing by the lounge window, he was just another passenger waiting for his flight to New York. Mr. Thomas, a gate agent called, approaching him with the careful politeness reserved for those who lived on the higher end of the spectrum. "We're ready to board now." He nodded, collected his leather briefcase, and made his way toward the gate. The path through the terminal was unremarkable, filled with soft announcements and the faint rustle of boarding passes against palm sweat. As Adrian handed his ticket to the gate agent, she offered him a warm smile. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Thomas." He returned the smile politely, stepping onto the plane with the measured grace of someone accustomed to moving in spaces not always designed for him. Inside the first-class cabin, the air felt different, cooler, crisper, and quieter than the rest of the plane. There were fewer passengers, fewer eyes. Adrian made his way to his window seat, tucking his briefcase beneath the chair in front of him. He settled in, pulling out his tablet and beginning to review emails. For a while, it was just the soft click of his fingers on the screen and the distant sounds of boarding. Peaceful, routine. Then she arrived, a flight attendant, tall and sharp-featured, her uniform pressed to perfection, stopped beside his seat. Her name tag read, Olivia Carter. There was no warmth in her eyes as she looked down at him. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "are you sure you're in the right seat?" Adrian glanced up, meeting her gaze with an expression that did not falter. "Yes, this is my seat." Her brows narrowed slightly, a flicker of something beneath the surface, something he recognized all too well. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." He paused for a beat, measuring her tone. It wasn't the request itself, it was the way it was framed, the slight edge, the lingering doubt that hung between them like fog. Adrian reached into his jacket and retrieved the pass, handing it over without a word. Olivia studied it, her lips tightening at the corners before she returned it to him. "Well," she said, her eyes lingering on him for a second too long, "let me know if you need help understanding any of the first-class amenities." He knew what she meant. The words were polite, but the implication dripped from every syllable. It was the same melody he had heard all his life, sung with the same refrain. "Are you sure you belong here?" Adrian took the boarding pass, sliding it back into his pocket as she walked away. The crease in his brow smoothed out, but something settled in his chest, a familiar weight. Across the aisle, a man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard raised an eyebrow. Having witnessed the exchange, he didn't say anything, but his look was one of quiet acknowledgment. Adrian offered him a faint smile, returning to his tablet, but the weight remained. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. Minutes passed, and as the cabin filled, Olivia moved gracefully through the rows, offering warm smiles and easy conversation to the other passengers. But when she reached Adrian's seat during drink service, her hand hesitated briefly over his tray. And then she moved on without stopping. Marcus, the man across the aisle, leaned in slightly. She skipped you, he said under his breath, as if the observation needed confirmation. Adrian nodded. It seems so. Marcus shook his head, sitting back with a faint sigh. For the remainder of the boarding process, Adrian said nothing. He watched as Olivia moved through the cabin with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of performing the same steps. And yet, with each glance in his direction, her expression tightened, as if his presence unsettled the very fabric of the cabin. The subtlety was the point. This was not a storm that came crashing in. It was a quiet drizzle. The kind of thing that soaked you over time, wearing you down slowly. Adrian had seen storms, but he knew the drizzle was often more dangerous. As the plane filled, Adrian Thomas remained an island of stillness amid the subtle shuffle of passengers claiming their seats. The leather pressed softly beneath him as he shifted his gaze to the window. Watching the tarmac glow faintly beneath the airport's overhead lights, the hum of conversation ebbed and flowed around him. Small moments of connection unfolding between strangers who shared nothing more than this temporary space in the sky. Yet, even as the soft murmur wrapped itself around him, Adrian was acutely aware of something else, something colder, quieter. It sat in the air, between the breaths and pleasantries, like the faintest trace of smoke that lingers long after the fire is gone. Olivia Carter returned down the aisle, her heels tapping lightly against the floor, each step deliberate and sure. She moved with the assurance of someone who belonged, someone who could bend the small, delicate rules of civility without consequence. As she passed by, Adrian felt the glance brief but weighted, the kind of look that measured and assessed, even if she didn't know she was doing it. That's how it always began. Small, almost imperceptible gestures, a narrowing of the eyes, a slight hesitation in the voice. The smallest doubt planted and nurtured into something larger, something harder to unroot. Adrian had spent much of his life learning the language of these gestures. This dance of quiet exclusions. He could feel it in the way Olivia leaned a little closer to other passengers when pouring their wine. In how her voice softened as she joked with the couple in front of him. Her laughter blooming easy and free. But when she reached him, her posture straightened just slightly. The ease disappeared, replaced by something else, something brittle. Would you like a drink, Mr. Thomas? Adrian lifted his eyes from his tablet. He could feel Marcus's gaze across the aisle. The words were simple enough, polite enough, but there was no softness to them. Water is fine, Adrian replied, voice measured. She poured it carefully, set the glass down without another word, and moved on. Marcus leaned slightly toward him again, his tone low. Funny how some folks forget how to smile when they're uncomfortable. Adrian allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Some folks don't even realize they stopped smiling. Marcus chuckled under his breath. That's the damn truth. But beneath the lightness, Adrian felt something stirring, something that lived just below the surface, where polite conversation could not reach. This wasn't about Olivia, not entirely. She was simply the face of it today. The latest in a long line of interactions that reminded Adrian the sky was not as free as it seemed. The flight attendants prepared the cabin for takeoff, the gentle rustle of seatbelts clicking into place echoing softly around them. Olivia's voice drifted over the intercom, calm and rehearsed. As the plane began to roll forward, Adrian's mind wandered. There had been a time, years ago, when Adrian believed these small slights could be brushed off, like dust on his shoulder. He told himself that the best way to rise above it was to simply rise higher. Faster, further. And he had risen. But the thing about dust is that it finds its way into every crack, every unseen corner. Over time, it collects, no matter how much you pretend not to notice. The plane lifted off, breaking free from the earth, but not from the weight it carried. The climb was smooth. The lights of the city faded beneath them, giving way to the quiet blackness of the night sky. Adrian exhaled softly, letting his head rest against the back of his seat. But peace would not last. About 30 minutes into the flight, Olivia returned to the first-class cabin. This time, she stopped at Adrian's row, standing just close enough that Marcus raised an eyebrow. Mr. Thomas, she said, her voice neutral but tight. Could I speak with you privately in the galley? Adrian didn't move right away. He let the request linger in the air between them, as if testing its weight. Marcus's gaze flicked toward Adrian. Silent but clearly curious. Is there an issue with my seat? Adrian asked. Olivia's expression tightened. No, sir. It's just a small matter I'd like to clarify. Adrian glanced at Marcus briefly before rising to his feet. In the narrow galley, Olivia's stance shifted slightly as he joined her. There was something in the way she held herself, shoulders squared, arms stiff, that made Adrian feel as if he had crossed an invisible line. I've noticed that there may have been an error in your booking, Olivia said, voice lowering but losing none of its firmness. I just want to confirm that your seat assignment was correctly processed. Adrian's brow furrowed, though his expression remained calm. My boarding pass was scanned when I boarded the plane. Was there an issue with it? She hesitated, glancing briefly toward the curtain that separated them from the rest of the cabin. It's just a formality. We have specific protocols for first-class passengers. Adrian's voice sharpened, though only slightly. Are these protocols different for me than for the other passengers? Her lips pressed together. No, of course not. Adrian let the silence stretch. Then I'd like to return to my seat. For a moment, Olivia didn't move. Her eyes flicked toward the rest of the cabin, as if searching for something she could not find. Finally, she stepped aside. Adrian returned to his seat without another word. Marcus leaned in once more as soon as Adrian sat down. I take it she wasn't asking about the in-flight entertainment? No, Adrian replied. She wasn't. Marcus shook his head, muttering something under his breath. The hum of the engines filled the space between them, but the air felt heavier now. And Adrian knew this was far from over. Adrian Thomas had barely settled back into his seat when the weight of Olivia's presence lingered. Heavy as fog, he could feel her, even when she wasn't there. It wasn't the kind of awareness one cultivates by choice. It was learned, etched into the bones after years of moving through spaces where his presence was questioned before he spoke a word. Marcus, the man across the aisle, leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. I don't know about you, but I don't remember first class coming with this much attention to detail. Adrian allowed himself a small, wry smile. Attention can be selective, can't it? Marcus chuckled, but his expression held something more, a quiet understanding that stretched beyond the moment. Yeah, I suppose it can. But beneath the polite exchange, Adrian's mind sharpened, cutting through the softness of the cabin. He could feel the rhythm of it now, the slow tightening of the noose that began with a glance, escalated to a question, and now followed him like an echo. It was a rhythm he'd encountered in boardrooms where his competence was treated like an anomaly. In hotel lobbies where his suit wasn't enough to convince anyone he belonged. And in classrooms, long ago, where teachers always asked if he'd meant to sign up for the advanced class. The pattern rarely changed, but tonight, it was playing out 30,000 feet in the air. And Adrian wasn't certain how far Olivia planned to take it. The challenge wasn't always in the overt. A slur or an insult was almost preferable. At least then, the enemy revealed itself plainly. But this quiet friction was different. It pressed against his skin, soft but persistent, demanding that he prove himself over and over. The worst part was that Olivia likely didn't think she was doing anything wrong. She thought she was doing her job. As if the idea of someone like him, someone black, successful, seated comfortably in first class, was an error in need of correction. Another 20 minutes passed, and Adrian forced himself to focus on the soft glow of his tablet. He thumbed through emails and documents, but the words blurred together, unable to hold his attention. Then, Olivia returned. It was subtle at first. She passed through the cabin, her hands steady as she refilled drinks and adjusted tray tables. But when she reached Adrian's row, she slowed, her gaze flicking toward his untouched glass of water. Is everything all right, Mr. Thomas? Her voice was polite, but something hid beneath it, like the sharp edge of glass under silk. Adrian met her gaze, careful to keep his own voice calm. Everything's fine, thank you. A beat of silence passed between them. She lingered. Marcus watched. His eyes narrowed slightly. Good, Olivia finally said, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed her. She moved on, but Adrian wasn't fooled. She was circling. This wasn't over. As she disappeared behind the curtain leading to the galley, Marcus shifted in his seat. I don't know what you did to get under her skin, he said, but it's starting to feel personal. Adrian glanced toward the galley. It usually is, even when it isn't. Marcus frowned. How do you mean? Adrian exhaled softly, weighing his words. Sometimes people don't even realize what they're doing. But somewhere, deep down, they've decided you're out of place. And once they make that decision, they look for ways to prove it, small ways. Quiet ways. Marcus was silent for a moment. You're saying she doesn't even know she's doing it? Oh, she knows, Adrian replied, but she's convinced herself that it's about procedure. About rules. Marcus shook his head slowly. Hell of a way to live. Adrian's gaze returned to the window. It is, but I've seen it before. The plane dipped slightly, catching a pocket of turbulence that sent a ripple of movement through the cabin. Passengers stirred, adjusting their seats and stretching their legs. The subtle rocking seemed to break the moment's tension, if only for a breath. But then Olivia returned, and this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, a taller man followed, his silver hair neatly combed, his uniform crisp. His name tag read Jonathan, head attendant. Adrian knew what was coming before Olivia opened her mouth. Mr. Thomas, she said, her tone rehearsed. Jonathan would like to have a word with you. Adrian's grip on the armrest tightened. But outwardly, he remained composed. He looked at Jonathan, whose expression was professional but unreadable. Is there a problem with my seat, Jonathan? Adrian asked, his voice even. Jonathan hesitated. Not at all, sir. We've just had some irregularities reported. And I wanted to personally ensure everything is in order. Irregularities. Adrian's eyes flicked to Olivia. She avoided his gaze. Marcus leaned closer, barely masking his disbelief. Irregularities? Are you kidding me? Jonathan ignored him, focusing on Adrian. Adrian let the silence stretch for a moment, measuring Jonathan carefully. Finally, he spoke, his tone soft but firm. I presented my ticket at the gate. It was scanned without issue. I was escorted to this seat by your staff. What irregularity could there possibly be? Jonathan shifted slightly, as if the weight of the conversation was beginning to settle on his shoulders. I understand, sir, he said carefully. I appreciate your cooperation. Olivia opened her mouth, but Jonathan cut her off with a glance. That will be all, Olivia. She stiffened. For a second, it seemed like she might argue. But instead, she nodded and disappeared into the galley, leaving Jonathan standing awkwardly in the aisle. I apologize, Mr. Thomas, he said. Adrian nodded but didn't respond immediately. Marcus spoke for him. I think you owe him more than an apology. Jonathan's lips thinned. I'll make sure he's not disturbed again. Adrian finally allowed himself to lean back in his seat, though the tension remained beneath the surface. As Jonathan walked away, Marcus turned to Adrian, shaking his head. I thought we left this kind of thing behind years ago. Adrian's eyes stayed on the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly across the horizon. It never really left, Adrian said softly. It just learned to smile first. The first-class cabin had grown quiet. But silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, silence hums with the tension of words unspoken. Glances exchange, and the weight of things left to linger too long. Adrian Thomas leaned back in his seat, fingers lightly tapping the armrest, though he wasn't sure whether it was out of habit or restraint. Across the aisle, Marcus watched him carefully, the lines around his eyes tightening with quiet sympathy. Jonathan, the head attendant, had returned to his station, and Olivia Carter had disappeared behind the curtain to the galley. But Adrian knew better than to believe this was the end of it. These things rarely ended cleanly. What was left behind was the residue, something subtle yet unshakable. The kind of thing that followed you home, stayed with you at the dinner table, interrupted your sleep, and by morning, you convinced yourself it had been nothing. That you were imagining the slight curve in her tone or the way Jonathan's apology had felt just hollow enough to echo. But Adrian wasn't imagining it. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous encounters weren't the loud ones. They were the quiet ones, wrapped neatly in polite smiles and well-rehearsed explanations. Irregularities, Jonathan had said, a word that could mean nothing or everything depending on who you were. Adrian shifted slightly in his seat, glancing out the window as the soft glow of the city lights vanished beneath the clouds. There was a time when he might have let this slide, accepted the apology, and buried the discomfort beneath layers of restraint. But not tonight. Tonight, something sat differently within him. Mr. Thomas, Marcus's voice broke the silence, his tone cautious but firm. You're handling this better than most would. But I've got to ask, how often does this happen to you? Adrian didn't turn his head. His gaze remained fixed on the darkness outside. Often enough, Adrian said softly. Often enough that I could write a book about it. Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Damned shame. Adrian finally looked at him. His expression calm but pointed. It's not shame, Marcus. Shame implies something hidden, something rare. This isn't rare. It's woven into the air we breathe. Marcus held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. He seemed to want to say more, but the weight of Adrian's words pressed down on the space between them, making the effort unnecessary. The curtain to the galley shifted slightly, and Olivia reappeared, her footsteps precise and her face carefully composed. She didn't look at Adrian directly, but he felt her proximity like a tightening cord. She moved down the aisle, attending to other passengers, pouring drinks, adjusting blankets, and offering soft reassurances to those who asked for them. Her professionalism, now in overdrive, felt like an attempt to smooth over the earlier encounter, as if politeness could erase the undercurrent that had already been set in motion. But Adrian wasn't interested in being smoothed over. As Olivia approached Marcus's row, Adrian's calm voice cut through the soft hum of the cabin. Miss Carter. Her back straightened immediately. Yes, Mr. Thomas? She asked, turning slightly, though she kept a careful distance. Adrian's gaze was steady. I'd like to know what irregularities you believed required Jonathan's attention. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, clearly intrigued by the shift in tone. Olivia's fingers tightened around the tray she held. As I mentioned before, sir, it was simply a formality. Irregularities, Adrian interrupted, his voice smooth but unrelenting. That's the word you used. I'd like to know exactly what that meant in my case. Olivia hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Jonathan at the front of the cabin as if searching for backup. But Jonathan stayed rooted at his station, his head low, unwilling to intervene. Adrian pressed on. I travel frequently, Miss Carter. I've had my boarding pass scanned at countless gates. Taken more flights than I can count. I understand how protocol works. So explain it to me. What was irregular about me? A pause stretched between them, long enough that Marcus leaned forward slightly, as if bracing for the response. Finally, Olivia's carefully constructed facade began to crack. There was no irregularity, she admitted, her voice quieter now, though her tone lacked apology. I misjudged the situation. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. Misjudged? Olivia's lips thinned, and for the first time that evening, she met his gaze directly. There was something defiant there, not hostility, but the kind of pride that resists accountability. I thought, she began, but the sentence hung unfinished. Adrian let her linger in the weight of her unfinished thought. Thought what? He asked, his voice gentle but piercing. Her silence spoke louder than any explanation she could have offered. Marcus, unable to contain himself any longer, exhaled loudly and shook his head. This is why things don't change, he muttered, his frustration palpable, because no one's willing to just admit what's right in front of them. Olivia's gaze dropped briefly to the floor before she gathered herself, straightening her posture once more. I apologize for the misunderstanding, she said, the words carefully rehearsed, but hollow in a way that only Adrian could hear. Adrian didn't respond immediately. He studied her, not with anger, but with the same quiet, known gaze he'd learned to perfect over decades. Apologies are easy, Miss Carter, Adrian finally said. Change is harder. Olivia nodded stiffly and disappeared down the aisle, leaving Adrian and Marcus alone once again. For a while, neither of them spoke. The plane cruised on, steady and unbothered by the turbulence happening inside its walls. You handled that well, Marcus said at last, though his voice carried a note of disbelief. Better than I would have. Adrian's lips curved slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I've had practice. Marcus laughed, but there was no joy in it. Yeah, Marcus said softly, leaning back in his seat. I bet you have. The quiet that followed Olivia Carter's retreat should have felt like relief. But it didn't. Adrian Thomas remained still, his gaze fixed out the small oval window. But his reflection stared back at him more clearly than the clouds below. He could see the faint tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders squared just a little too stiffly against the plush leather seat. He let out a slow breath, willing the muscles in his neck to loosen. It wasn't the words Olivia had used or avoided that held his attention now. It was the fact that he had been here before. Too many times. Marcus had gone quiet across the aisle. But Adrian could feel the weight of his eyes. It was the look of someone trying to understand something just out of reach. As if by watching long enough, the pieces might arrange themselves into an image that made sense. Marcus eventually broke the silence with a voice soft but pointed. You know, it's funny. Adrian raised an eyebrow. What is? Marcus shifted in his seat, his hands folding across his lap. All this talk about progress. About how far we've come. And yet, here we are. He shook his head, as if trying to make sense of his own words. I thought these kinds of things were stories my father used to tell me about. Guess I was wrong. Adrian's gaze drifted back to the clouds. The stories change shape, Marcus, but the plot stays the same. Marcus chuckled dryly. You sure you're not a writer? Adrian smirked faintly. No, just someone who's learned how to read the room. They sat in the quiet again. But this time it felt heavier. Because the truth was, Marcus wasn't wrong. There was something uniquely exhausting about confronting the same obstacles. Decade after decade, while the world convinced itself that change had already come and gone. It hadn't. It dressed differently now, subtler. Quieter. But it was still there. Olivia's absence from the first-class cabin didn't last long. She returned about 15 minutes later. But her demeanor had shifted. She no longer stopped to check on the passengers she had once fussed over. Nor did she linger to exchange pleasantries. Instead, she moved through the cabin with the careful, clipped efficiency of someone hoping to disappear. Marcus noticed it too. Seems like she's trying to stay out of your way now. He whispered. Adrian's lips tightened. That's not the same as understanding. Marcus sighed. No, I suppose it's not. And yet, despite the slight shift in Olivia's behavior, Adrian could feel something else simmering just beneath the surface. The thing about being quieted is that it doesn't erase the fire, it simply forces it to smolder. Jonathan, the head attendant, appeared near the galley, his eyes scanning the cabin. When his gaze met Adrian's, there was a brief flicker of acknowledgment, a silent nod that seemed to say, I see what's happening. But I don't know what to do about it. Adrian looked away. That was the other side of the coin. Even when someone recognized the pattern, too often they chose to look the other way. Because looking directly at it meant admitting something uncomfortable. That they had been part of the silence. 2. The plane hummed along steadily. But Adrian could feel the air thickening again. It wasn't over. It never ended as neatly as an apology. No matter how reluctant or rehearsed. Sure enough, when Olivia returned to the front of the cabin for another round of drink service, Adrian noticed the glance she exchanged with Jonathan. It was brief, so brief that Marcus missed it entirely. But Adrian didn't. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous moves happened in plain sight. Hidden behind veils of professionalism and carefully chosen words. Marcus's voice lowered again. You think she's going to try something else? Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. She doesn't have to. The damage is already done. Marcus frowned. How do you mean? Adrian set his glass down carefully. She's planted the seed. It doesn't matter if Jonathan dismissed it. There will always be that lingering question. A quiet, what if, she left behind for others to pick up. Marcus leaned back, exhaling slowly as he considered that. Hell of a thing to live with. Adrian's eyes softened slightly. You learn to live with it. But you never really get used to it. For a while, neither of them spoke. The cabin dimmed as the sun slipped further below the horizon, casting long shadows across the aisles. Passengers began settling in for the remainder of the flight. But Adrian remained alert, his gaze shifting every so often to the front of the plane. And then, Olivia made her next move. She stopped just a few rows ahead, leaning down to speak softly with a passenger Adrian hadn't noticed before. A middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard, reading a thick hardcover novel. Adrian couldn't hear the words, but he didn't have to. The slight nod from the man, followed by the subtle glance in Adrian's direction, said enough. Marcus noticed too. She's talking about you, he muttered. Adrian's voice was calm but firm. Yes, she is. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. Man, I thought this was settled. It's never settled, Adrian replied. It just finds another door to slip through. The man with the novel eventually leaned back. But Adrian could feel the shift. The damage was subtle, quiet but real. That was how these things worked. By the time the flight landed, Adrian knew that whatever story Olivia had chosen to tell would likely outlast the truth of what had actually happened. Because the thing about quiet exclusion, the kind wrapped in politeness and hidden behind professionalism, is that it spreads faster than confrontation. And it rarely leaves fingerprints. The plane descended slowly, the flicker of city lights threading beneath the wings like veins of gold against the dark earth. Adrian Thomas could feel the subtle shift in the cabin, the quiet recalibration that happens when people sense the journey is nearing its end. Seatbacks straightened, blankets folded, conversations lowered to soft murmurs. But for Adrian, the descent brought no such release. He felt it still. The thread Olivia Carter had left dangling in the air, thin but unbreakable. Marcus shifted in his seat across the aisle, adjusting his watch with the restless energy of someone eager to touch solid ground. But Adrian remained composed. Though his stillness wasn't peace, it was precision. "Almost there," Marcus said, his voice light, trying to meet the moment where it stood. Adrian nodded faintly but said nothing. His eyes lingered on the galley, where Olivia had stationed herself once more, her movements calculated and distant. She hadn't approached him again. She didn't need to. What was left unspoken had already done its work. That was how it often unfolded, not with a fight or raised voices, but with the planting of doubt. And doubt was insidious. It crept into corners, whispered beneath closed doors, and lingered long after the moment had passed. Adrian watched as Olivia spoke briefly with Jonathan, the head attendant. Their exchange was hushed, just out of earshot, but Adrian recognized the body language. Jonathan's brow furrowed as she spoke. But whatever she said, it wasn't enough to pull him fully into the storm. Jonathan nodded lightly, not dismissively, but in that way people do when they want to acknowledge something without carrying the weight of it. And that, too, was familiar. Marcus caught the glance, leaning in again. "You think she's trying to get him on her side?" Adrian's expression didn't change. "She doesn't need to. People will protect their comfort before they protect the truth." Marcus exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Man, I've seen it before, but I guess I didn't expect it up here. Not in first class." Adrian's eyes drifted from Marcus back to the window. "It's not about where you sit, Marcus. It's about who they expect to see sitting there." Marcus paused, considering that. After a moment, he nodded. "I hear you." The flight continued its slow descent, the soft ping of the seatbelt sign chiming overhead. Passengers began collecting their belongings, the quiet rustle of coats and bags filling the space. But Adrian remained still, his briefcase untouched by his feet. Olivia had not approached him directly since Jonathan's quiet intervention. But as Adrian glanced down the aisle, he caught the gaze of the man with the novel, the one Olivia had whispered to earlier. The man didn't look away. Adrian met his gaze, steady and unwavering. And there it was, the flicker, the small narrowing of the eyes, the tightening at the corners of the mouth. A face that had already made up its mind without ever hearing Adrian speak. It was not anger, it was certainty. Adrian could almost hear the man's thoughts, as if they hung in the air between them. She wouldn't have said anything if there wasn't some truth to it. Marcus saw it too, his voice dropping. "You want me to say something?" Adrian's gaze didn't waver. "No. You sure?" "I'm sure." Marcus hesitated, but the weight in Adrian's voice left no room for argument. There were some battles best left unfought. Not because they weren't worth fighting, but because the game had been rigged long before it began. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the runway with practiced ease. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Marcus gathered his jacket, but his eyes flicked to Adrian once more. "Look," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. "I know this probably isn't news to you, but I'll say it anyway. You handled it better than most would have." Adrian finally turned toward him, his expression softening slightly. "Handling it doesn't mean it didn't happen." Marcus nodded solemnly. As the plane came to a full stop, the seatbelt sign clicked off, and the familiar shuffle of impatient passengers filled the cabin. Adrian stayed seated, watching as Olivia made her way toward the front of the plane. When she passed his row, she didn't stop, but her gaze lingered just a second too long. It wasn't defiance, it was fear. She didn't know what he might do, and that uncertainty unsettled her more than any confrontation ever could. Adrian let her go, because he knew something Olivia hadn't yet learned, something that came from living long enough to see the same play repeat itself over and over. The moment wasn't about her. It was about the shadow she had cast. the quiet doubt she had left hanging in the space between them. And that doubt, unlike her presence, would linger long after she stepped off the plane. As the line of passengers began to filter out, Marcus stood, pausing just before stepping into the aisle. "I hope I see you again, Adrian." Adrian met his gaze, offering a faint but genuine smile. "I suspect you will, Marcus. This world isn't that big." Marcus chuckled lightly and disappeared down the aisle. Adrian waited. Only when the cabin had mostly emptied did he rise, collecting his briefcase with the same steady grace he had carried onto the plane. When he reached the front, Jonathan was waiting near the exit. His eyes flickered with something unspoken, perhaps regret, perhaps discomfort. "Mr. Thomas," Jonathan said softly, "I'm sorry about earlier. I hope you understand." "Olivia." Adrian stopped him with a calm, measured look. "I understand, Jonathan." Jonathan nodded, relief washing over his face. But as Adrian stepped off the plane, he left Jonathan with one final thought. Understanding doesn't excuse it. Jonathan's polite smile faltered, and Adrian walked on, leaving behind the thin veil of politeness that had barely concealed the truth beneath. The airport terminal stretched before Adrian Thomas in long corridors of glass and polished tile. Bathed in the quiet glow of evening lights, the echo of footsteps and faint announcements filtered through the air, but Adrian moved through it with the kind of stillness that wasn't easily disturbed. He could feel the day's weight pressing against his back, not in the exhaustion of travel, but in the lingering residue of what had unfolded on the plane. Racism had a way of following you long after you'd walked away from it. Adrian adjusted his briefcase, passing through the terminal at an even pace. He wasn't in a rush, he rarely was. Time had taught him that hurrying did little to alter the inevitable. But as he approached the baggage claim, he saw something that slowed him further. Olivia Carter stood off to the side, near a row of seats against the glass wall. Her arms were crossed, and though she wasn't looking directly at him, Adrian recognized the way people occupy space when they're hoping to be noticed without extending the first olive branch. He considered ignoring her. He had every right to. But Adrian Thomas wasn't a man who moved through life by avoiding things. So he adjusted the strap of his briefcase and closed the distance between them. His footsteps soft against the marble floor. When he stopped, Olivia finally looked up. Her eyes flickered with surprise. But she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice measured but thin. "I didn't expect to see you here." Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "I wasn't expecting to stop. But since you're here," he let the sentence hang, unfinished. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Olivia shifted slightly, pressing her palm against the seat beside her as if grounding herself. "I suppose I owe you another apology." Adrian tilted his head, studying her carefully. "Is that why you're standing here?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came immediately. She glanced away, out toward the parking lot beyond the glass. "I guess I just wanted to explain." Adrian let out a quiet breath. He'd heard those words before. "I just wanted to explain." It was the anthem of those who didn't want to confront what they already knew. "Explain what, Miss Carter?" he asked gently. "That you assumed I didn't belong up there with the rest of your first-class passengers?" Her jaw tightened. "I didn't." Adrian raised a hand lightly. "You did. Let's not pretend otherwise. The truth doesn't need to apologize for itself." She swallowed hard, folding her arms again. "I don't know why I reacted that way," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I was trying to do my job. Or maybe it was something else." Adrian nodded slowly. "It was something else." Olivia's eyes flicked back to his. But this time, there was no trace of defensiveness. Only quiet resignation. "You've probably dealt with this 1,000 times," she said. Adrian smiled faintly. "More times than I care to count." She shifted her weight, rubbing the side of her neck absently. "I wasn't raised to think that way. I mean, I thought I wasn't." Adrian's gaze softened, but the edge in his voice remained. "None of us think we were raised to see the world through those eyes. But it finds its way in, whether we notice or not." The airport quieted around them, the flow of passengers thinning as the last flights of the evening began boarding. "You know what the hardest part is?" Adrian asked, his tone dropping lower. Olivia looked at him, waiting. "It's not the moments like this," Adrian said. "It's knowing that tomorrow, someone else will sit in that same seat and go through the same thing. And the day after that. And the day after that." Her face tightened with quiet shame. I don't know how to fix that. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. Neither do I. But acknowledgment is a start. Silence keeps the door open for it to happen again. She nodded slowly, as if the weight of his words was beginning to settle on her shoulders in a way it hadn't before. I'm not asking for anything, Adrian added, his voice calm but firm. Not from you, but I hope the next time you feel that hesitation, you stop and ask yourself why. Olivia swallowed again, and for the first time that evening, her shoulders dropped slightly, as if she were letting go of something she'd been gripping too tightly. Thank you, she said softly. Adrian nodded but didn't linger. He didn't need to. As he turned to leave, Olivia's voice followed him, quiet but distinct against the hum of the terminal. I'll remember this. Adrian glanced back briefly, offering her a faint but knowing smile. See that you do. And with that, he walked on, the glass doors sliding open ahead of him. The door had never been closed to begin with. But perhaps, just perhaps, a crack of light had found its way through. The night air was cool against Adrian Thomas's skin as he stepped through the glass doors of the terminal. The faint hum of the airport faded behind him, swallowed by the quiet stretch of parked cars and distant headlights. He paused for a moment at the curb, the briefcase in his hand feeling heavier than it had before. Not because of what it carried, but because of the weight that had settled on him, the weight that never truly left. The world outside the airport moved on as if nothing had happened. And for most people, nothing had. But Adrian knew better. The problem with racism is that it doesn't end when the moment passes. It settles in the bones. It lingers in the heart. It becomes part of the architecture of your being, long after the plane has landed and the apologies, real or rehearsed, have been spoken. Adrian placed his briefcase down by his feet and exhaled slowly. This wasn't anger. He had lived through anger before, and it had burned too hot to hold onto for long. No, this was something quieter. Weariness. The kind of weariness that comes from living in a body the world insists on questioning. The kind that comes from explaining, again and again, that your seat was paid for the same way as everyone else's. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and the driver stepped out, nodding toward Adrian. Mr. Thomas? Adrian nodded, exchanging the briefest of pleasantries before slipping into the back seat. As the city lights flickered by, Adrian let his head rest against the cool glass of the window. The hum of the tires against the road filled the silence, but his mind was elsewhere. The memory of Olivia Carter's gaze followed him. It wasn't malicious. That was the part that stayed with him. It would be easier if it had been, if she had been one of those faces contorted with hate. The ones who didn't bother to hide what they thought of him. Adrian knew how to meet that kind of ugliness. But Olivia's doubt had been quieter, softer, wrapped in the veil of professionalism. The kind of racism that smiles at you. And that was harder to confront. Because what do you say to someone who believes, in the deepest part of themselves, that they mean well? The city stretched on outside the window. But Adrian saw none of it. He thought back to Marcus, sitting across the aisle, shaking his head in quiet frustration. Marcus, who had been surprised not at the idea that racism still existed, but that it could be so polite. And maybe that was the thing people like Marcus struggled with most. The realization that it never had to scream to be heard. Everything all right back there, sir? The driver asked, his voice breaking through the silence. Adrian glanced up, offering a polite nod. Fine, thank you. But fine was a lie, wasn't it? It wasn't fine. It was tolerable. And there was a difference. Adrian could hear his father's voice, echoing from somewhere long ago, a voice that carried the same quiet weariness Adrian felt now. You can endure almost anything, son, but endurance isn't the same as freedom. His father had been right. Adrian had endured plenty. But what did freedom look like for someone like him, someone who had done everything by the book, played the game by every rule, and still found himself having to explain his place in it? As the car turned down a quieter street, Adrian let out a slow breath. Maybe freedom wasn't something he could feel in his lifetime. But maybe, just maybe, he could leave behind something that chipped away at the walls for someone else. His phone vibrated in his pocket, pulling him back into the present. A message from Marcus. Next time, drinks are on me. And next time, I say something when it happens. Safe travels. Adrian. Adrian smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. He appreciated the sentiment, but he knew the truth Marcus hadn't yet fully grasped. There would always be a next time. But perhaps, next time, the weight wouldn't rest so heavily on Adrian's shoulders alone. As the car rolled to a stop outside his building, Adrian stepped onto the sidewalk and paused. He glanced up at the sky, where the faint glow of city lights drowned out the stars. For a moment, he let the stillness wash over him. The world wouldn't change overnight. He knew that, but even the heaviest doors, if pressed enough, would one day swing open. Adrian adjusted his briefcase and stepped inside.